As customary, I want to thank everyone for posting their questions and making this video possible. Let's begin. Did you ever interact with any lifers while you were in prison? And how did you feel about their situation? The majority of the guys I was with had life sentences or life as their back number, for example, 15 to life, 25 to life, etc. In prison, we all believed our sentences were excessive. However, when you're with guys that are never going home, it made you appreciate whatever sentence you had. With the exception of a few people, we were all guilty of committing crimes. And one of the things I quickly learned was the unfairness when it came to sentencing. You would see two people with identical crimes with very different sentences. I knew of one guy who committed an unthinkable crime with the sentence that reflected a crime such as a petty robbery, and another guy who did commit a petty robbery with the sentence more fit for the first guy mentioned. It's an extremely biased system. What are the pros and cons of having your associate inducted? Good question. Unfortunately, most guys want to keep their people down. There's money being kicked up to them, and for their own greed, having a particular associate be inducted would stop that money from coming in. In that life, you should want to see your people do good. Having an associate become a member not only beefs up your crew, but also your family. If one of your associates gets inducted, and you in turn become a captain, he'll most likely be in your crew, and you have yourself a strong ally. This next person wants to know if children born out of wedlock was common in the Mafia, and if so, would a punishment be given out accordingly, and how severe? Well, to start with, a guy's personal life is supposed to be just that. Throughout the world, children are born out of wedlock, and it's nobody's business, and no punishment is attributed to it. Did you know Andrew Gigante to be a Genovese member? His father, Chin Gigante, was dead set against his sons being inducted. After his passing, both his sons became members of the Genovese family. I was told by several people it was done more to protect them, not from any harm. The West Side, historically, likes to keep their money close to home. To what extent are locations like Bensonhurst, Howard Beach, Ozone Park, and Pelham Bay in relation to Italian residents? Bensonhurst, Brooklyn, has pockets of Italians, but has been predominantly overrun by Russians and Asians. Howard Beach still remains an Italian area, not as much as years ago, but for the most part, the majority of its residents are Italian. Ozone Park has changed significantly. There may still be some pockets of Italians, but the Indians, Pakistani, as well as people from other Middle Eastern countries now reside in that neighborhood. I don't really know much about Pelham Bay, but I'm sure it's also changed. What was the Mafia's take on prostitution? How often did members have girlfriends besides being married? Were some members single? And did people who you served time with generally become reformed or just less inclined to commit crimes once released? Historically, the mob profited from prostitution. I don't believe that to be the case today or during my time, although I did hear about a prostitution business that Frankie Cali had in the Dominican Republic years ago. A person very close to him had mentioned that business one day to me. Some members who were married had gumadas, side girls, and a lot of the guys were not married, so they did whatever they pleased. In prison, there were a handful of people who I believe were reformed. I wasn't one of them, obviously, but sometimes it takes an impactful incident to open one's eyes, and no one but that person can make changes in their life. And more importantly, no one has the right or authority, a more fitting word, to pass judgment about that. According to this next person, who speaks for a very large group of people in Western Nassau, which is a county in Long Island, they would like to hear my take on Ronnie One on coming home. Ronnie Trucchio is allegedly in bad health and has done a lot of time, so I wish him well. I remember the last time I seen him, Mike the Boxer and I were in Regine's in Manhattan, as was Ronnie, and he sent over a bottle of Cristal, and we returned the gesture. During your time, was the Brooklyn faction involved with underground poker games and casinos? Could a member or associate earn a decent living operating a card game or gambling den? I didn't know of anyone in our crew running such a business during my time. As for earning a living, many guys who were involved in the gambling rackets did pretty well for themselves. Was Jimmy Burke part of another gang, or was he only with Paul Vario? Jimmy Burke was a Lucchese associate who operated just as a captain with his own crew. How prevalent was car theft and chop shops when you were in the life? Any neighborhoods or boroughs more active in the trade during your time? There were chop shops still operating, not on the scale of years ago, during my time. As for areas that were more active, that's for the auto crime units to figure out. We're not going to help them do their jobs. That's what they get paid for. You mentioned in a previous video that certain members refuse to go into Big John's crew. How is that possible? Isn't it a failure to follow orders? There were many guys who refused to be in a crew headed by Big John. As I've mentioned, most of them didn't respect him. And it can only be a failure to carry out an order if in fact an order was given. At the time, the family was in transition, and a great deal of changes were taking place. Did you notice a major difference between the old-timers in that life and the current guys? And were the old-timers enthusiastic about the life or not optimistic about where things were headed? I've spoken at length about the differences between the newer members versus the old-timers. And don't get me wrong, some newer members knew how to carry themselves. But the mob as a whole is a shell of its former self. The majority of old-timers were disgusted with the life turned into. I've never heard one of them speak enthusiastically. Have you ever been up to the observation floor of the Empire State Building or the Twin Towers back in the day? I believe we took a school trip to the Empire State Building, and in or about 2018, I took my youngest daughter there as well. I've been to the Twin Towers years ago, but not up to the top. And on a side note, may all the people who perished on 9/11 rest in peace. If you had to choose between Rayo's, the Parkside, or Peter Luger's, where would you prefer to go and eat at? This is an easy one, hands down Peter Luger. I've always enjoyed their steak, cream spinach, bacon, and tomato and onion with their sauce. Which one of the 5 families is the most violent today? The correct answer is each one is capable of violence. But as I've stated multiple times, the mob now chooses to refrain from violence due to the consequences. For example, hypothetically, members discussing committing a violent act can result in this. The FBI informants relay that information, and it becomes a potential indictment. During your time in the Lucchese family, who were the youngest members you were aware of? And did you know of any associates who were younger and were on their way to being inducted? The youngest guys I knew of were Chris Londonio and Paulie Cassano. There weren't many younger guys, and I didn't know of any who were being put up, whose names were being passed around. And for the final question, when Stevie Correa met with the Brooklyn faction and was told about the change in the family's leadership, do you think he would have left the meeting alive had he refused to go along with the transition? Please remember to like this video if you haven't already, as it helps with YouTube's algorithm. And for anyone who'd like to show their appreciation for videos like this, or help me keep this podcast going, you can do so by the Super Thanks icon down below, or the PayPal Cash App links in the video's description. For starters, I don't believe that Stevie would have shown his hand right then and there. He's been around too long. But going with the question, hypothetically, had he? Yes. I believe he would have been able to walk out with his life, and not realizing that at the very least would have been about a week's worth.